As a woodworker, you can make anything. Look around the internet and you will find wood shops full of creative solutions to problems that we all face. And in today's video, I want to dive into 9 of my favorite shop projects that you can build right now to upgrade your shop, and there are plans for all of them. Let's get started. One of the most annoying things I have to deal with in the shop is this stupid shop vac hose. Because of the rib design of the hose itself, they always get caught on the edge of my workbench whenever I'm trying to use something like a sander, and it's really annoying. So that's why I created this movable boom arm that'll keep both your power cord and your shop vac hose easily out of the way and allow you to do whatever task you need to do. Hi, my name is Eric Spencley, and today I'm going to show you how you can create this super simple boom arm to put in your shop. Right now, lumber prices are absolutely insane. In my area, a 4x8 sheet of Baltic birch plywood is $189. Think I'm kidding? Here's the price sheet. That's why I raided my scrap pile and was pumped to see a panel that was the perfect amount that I needed for the project. Now, before I get too deep into the video, I do want to point out that there are free plans. Yes, I said free. There are free plans for this build linked down in the description. What you've seen me do so far is start breaking down some 3/4 inch plywood into strips that are going to make up the main, I guess, arm? Yeah, let's go with arm. They're gonna make up the main arm of the boom arm. But before we get too deep into cutting a bunch of pieces, let's jump into the SketchUp model to see how all of this is gonna come together. Now, this project is really fairly simple, but I still wanted to take a look around the model just so you can really follow exactly what I'm doing throughout the whole video. The main arm is comprised of 3 separate pieces. The 2 sides are the exact same, and the one in the middle is slightly wider and slightly shorter. Again, free plans that show all the dimensions and everything else you need are linked down below. Towards the back, there's this small box that allows you to insert your shop vac hose and power cord from below, and it also serves as an attachment point to the wall. This box is made from 2 side pieces, a front panel, and a back panel. See, that wasn't too bad. But now that you have a better idea of how this is going to go together, let's jump back into the garage. So focusing our attention back on the main arm, this is probably 100% unnecessary. But because Baltic birch plywood is so dense, I figured it probably wouldn't hurt to drill some holes in it to help reduce the weight. And I wouldn't be a real worker unless I spent a good 30 minutes perfectly laying out where all the holes should be spaced, right? I also think it's really important to mention that this idea spawned off of a video that I saw from John over at Lincoln Street Woodworks. I liked his boom arm and wanted to create something similar for my shop, so check out his channel if you haven't already. With all the holes marked out, I grabbed some scrap pieces of MDF to lay underneath my workpieces so that I didn't accidentally drill into my workbench. And to make sure that the holes matched on both pieces, I stacked them on top of each other and grabbed the dullest Forstner bit I could possibly find to drill out the holes. After 45 seconds, I wasn't really making much progress, so I figured I need to switch to a more powerful drill. And instead of putting it in the drill mode, I activate the most obnoxious sound in woodworking, the hammer drill mode. This definitely did work better, but I still only plowed through 3 holes.
That's what she said.
In about 3.5 minutes. So I figured it was time to call it a loss on that Forstner bit and move on to a spade bit. This was a much better decision. Spade bits are substantially faster, but they're more prone to causing tear out, which is why I typically tend to avoid them. And be smart here. If you're using a larger drill bit, if at all possible, try to use that auxiliary handle that comes with a lot of drills that prevent you from breaking your wrist. Oh, and hearing protection is a must too, because oh my gosh, hammer drills are unbelievably annoying. Alright, now with those holes hogged out, I can suck up all the chippy chips and get back to a regular workspace like magic. And because those pieces were clamped together, the holes are perfectly matched up, but the edges are a little bit sharp around the holes, so I grabbed my cordless trim router with a 1/4 inch roundover bit to start breaking the edges on all those holes. Everything was going great until the router decided it was done working. Full battery and everything, but it just kept shutting itself off after every hole or so.
I think it's time for a new router.
I walked across the street to the home center, and the nice fella at the counter just handed me a new one without having to deal with the warranty process, which was pretty cool, so I plowed the rest of the holes.
That's what she said.
And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Eric, Ryobi tools are total garbage and nobody should buy them. Honestly, I couldn't disagree with that more. Sure, they are entry-level tools, but they are more than capable of building just about anything. Are there higher quality tools available out there? Of course! But I've used and abused this one for almost 3 years, and for the $50 that I paid for it, that's a heck of a value. But if I can't get a free replacement the next time it breaks, I'll likely upgrade. I'm sure people have a lot to say about this, so let me know your thoughts about Ryobi tools down below. Anyway, to attach those pieces of the main arm together, I'm going to use some pocket holes. This new 720 Pro jig from Craig makes the process super easy, and unlike the spade bit that I was using earlier, it has built-in dust collection to keep things super clean. Then I'll throw down a little bit of glue action between all of the pieces and secure everything down with the pocket holes. Oh, and make sure to clamp the pieces together to make sure the pocket hole screws don't accidentally shift the pieces as you're driving them in. With the main arm all set, I can turn my focus to creating the rear box structure. These pieces need to be just a little bit more precise, so I'm using my precision miter gauge with built-in stop block. Now stop blocks are super handy to have. Not only does a stop block help hold your piece during the cut, but it also allows you to repeat a cut when you need to get the exact same measurement on another piece. All of the pieces for the rear box structure are going to receive some more pocket holes to help join everything together and just to give it a lot of strength. Since the main arm was finished earlier, I can flip it over and attach the back piece. And then slide the other 3 pieces over top before firing in the rest of the screws. To help prevent any nasty splinters when reaching overhead for the boom arm, and to match those holes, I rounded over all the exposed edges. This is a shop project, which means finish is 100% not required. However, I'm going to use some of this Total Boat Halcyon because it's really durable and dries super fast. I got this really cheap spray gun off of Amazon that works fine for shop projects like this, so I just sprayed on a couple coats and then let the finish dry for a few hours. While the finish dried, I went to the home center and picked up these hinges here, which I can attach to the side of the boom arm. I also got one of these fancy self-centering bits that's perfect for pre-drilling holes in hardware like this. Then I just need to fire in screws to hold all the hinges securely in place before popping this bad boy up on the wall. If at all possible, make sure that you're attaching this directly to a stud. It might work in drywall with the right anchors, but studs are definitely preferred here. And to my surprise, this thing actually worked on the first try. I didn't have to adjust the hinges or anything. I just need to move the wire running to my lights though. I can then run my shop vac hose up through the bottom of the boom arm and secure it in place with a couple zip ties. Oh, and I also ran a power cord up there too. But check this out. I can plug my sander into that cord, and because the special switch is on the other side, whenever I turn on the tool plugged into the cord, it automatically starts up the vacuum. Then, when the tool turns off, the vacuum does too. Pretty cool, huh? Now, I totally admit, it is kind of annoying having to toss the hose back up over the garage door tracks when I'm done, but it really only takes a couple seconds. That boom arm makes it so much easier to use the shop vac without getting that hose jammed up on all the edges of your workbench. Plus, with only a few scrap pieces, you can build one for yourself using the plans linked down in the description below. The next shop project solves an issue we are all plagued with, and that's what to do with all of these clamps. You need a system to store and organize all of these, or they will quickly turn into a giant mess. Let's dive into a solution for that. Hey, what's going on? My name is Eric Spencley, and today I'm going to show you how to build this super simple clamp rack that's perfect for storing those big and bulky parallel clamps, and also works perfectly for storing those small F-style clamps. Now let's get started. The renovation that I did on this garage a couple months ago turned out fantastic. All the walls are paneled really nicely. However, there's one small issue. I really have nowhere to put clamps. My quick and simple solution for the time being was just slapping the clamps up on the exposed rafters. However, one clamp fell off and completely snapped the handle that had epoxy back together, and the back. And another one fell and bent the lead screw so bad that it no longer works. So yeah, that was my fault. So instead of breaking more and more clamps and potentially hurting myself with these clamps falling from the ceiling, let's just make a simple clamp rack. For this project, all that you need is just a little bit of 3/4 inch plywood. 1/2 inch plywood might be okay here, but clamps are heavy, so I erred on the side of caution. Now, I am definitely not gonna need this entire panel of plywood, so I'm gonna cut it down to its final length of 50 inches. But since I don't wanna cut directly into my workbench, I'm gonna set down a couple pieces of foam insulation, that way I can cut, and I'm not gonna make any marks on my bench. This foam insulation is super cheap from any home center and serves as a perfect cutting surface for virtually any cut. After marking out the 50-inch mark where I need to cut this panel, I clamped down a straight edge, and after making sure that it was perfectly square, I ran my circular saw against the straight edge to get a dead straight cut. No fancy track saw needed here. So with this panel broken down to 50 inches, I know that all the other pieces that I cut out of this are also going to be the exact same length. This thing is going to go together perfectly. There are free, yes, free plans for this project listed down the link in the description, so check them out if you want to build this for yourself. When you grab those free plans, they tell you to start by ripping a 6 3/4 inch strip from that 50-inch long panel. Then slide your table saw fence over just a touch farther to 5 3/4 inch and rip another 50-inch long strip. Just a little bit more, moving your fence to 3.5 inches to rip another 50-inch long strip. Then lastly, slide your fence all the way in to 2 inches to rip that final 50-inch long strip, leaving you with 4 different size pieces. So with those 4 main pieces for the clamp rack cut down to size, we can set 3 of them aside and focus all of our attention on the 3.5 inch wide piece. This piece is going to be the one that actually holds all the clamps, so I marked, I think it'd probably be a lot clearer if I just jumped into SketchUp to show you exactly how this clamp rack is going to come together. So here's a brief overview of the model. You can see that the rack is made up of 6 individual pieces. 1 top shelf, 1 back panel, 1 clamp holder piece, 1 support piece, and then 2 sides. The piece that I want to work on right now is the clamp holder piece, so let's isolate that one. As you can tell, this is the piece where all the individual clamps are going to slot into. And to make that actually happen, I need to cut out all of these notches. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of the direction that I'm headed, so let's jump back into the garage. What I'm doing here is marking out all those notches that I need to cut out. Here's one for example, but I need to mark out each and every one. This is kind of tedious, so I cut a scrap piece to the exact width listed in those free plans and worked my way all the way across the board. Alright, so now that I've got all of the little notches marked out on this strip here, this is going to be where all of the individual clamps themselves would go and they can just slide right in. But we got to cut all these pieces out. So I figured that the fastest way to cut out all those notches would be with my dado stack. Now this was a mistake, but my other mistake was that apparently my microphone died, so let's do a little bit of overdubbing just like watching Squid Games.
Oh, look at that.
So I kind of feel like an idiot. I went to put the dado stack in the table saw and thought that this is going to be a super fast way to cut everything. And then I remembered that my dado stack is only a 6-inch diameter, which means that I only get about 1.5 inches of cutting height. Oh, looks like my mic is still dead. Alright, so my next idea was to just use a jigsaw to cut out all those notches, but the problem with the jigsaw is that it has a tendency to produce a lot of tear out and it's not super accurate. So then my idea was to use a bandsaw to cut out all these notches. With the size of my bandsaw, I could get the spots on the end, but there's really no way that I'd be able to get the ones on the inside. But after all those failed ideas, I think I have one that'll work. So instead of using that dado stack, I just pop back in my regular saw blade. But after all that gyration, now let's get them cut. Alright, I promised that there were only 2 more clips where my mic was dead, but I wanted to include those segments because creating all this content is just like woodworking. Sometimes we make mistakes and we have to work on overcoming things. Instead of scrapping all of your work and giving up, come up with a clever solution and make the best of it. Anyway, cutting all these notches out with the standard table saw blade was definitely not the fastest, but it was one of the only ways I could come up with at the time for cutting those notches out reliably. I basically just took my time lining up the blade to one mark and then chewed away all the material between the lines. But if you have any other ways that you can think that would have made this faster and maybe more precise, I'd be curious to hear them down in the comment section below. I should also mention that if there's a specific tool that you're curious about, there are links to every single tool that I own down in the description for you to learn more about them. There's also some great discount codes too for products you might enjoy. All in all, that process took me about 10 to 15 minutes, which isn't too bad considering how it turned out really well, plus no nasty tear out from the jigsaw. Real quick, I did want to let you know that I attached a sacrificial fence onto my miter gauge, that way there's no tear out on any of those pieces. And because these edges are a little sharp, I'm going to grab a 1/8 inch roundover bit and break all those edges over. Could you tell that I still didn't notice that my mic was dead there? Alright, seriously though. Now I promise that was the last overdub clip you'll have to suffer through, and I fixed it from now on. So now that we've got that piece where all the clamps are going to slot into, we need to attach it to a support piece just to give it a little bit more rigidity. And to do that, all I'm going to do is take my one smaller support piece and I'm going to put it in my pocket hole jig and drill out some pocket holes. Oh, and by the way, if you want to build the sweet boom arm that keeps your dust collection hose up and out of the way, there's a video linked to that in the description. Seriously though, having this boom arm is freaking nice because I don't have that hose dangling all over the floor and getting caught on my workbench anymore. Plus, it's really easy to build. With all those pocket holes cut in this piece now, I'll just lay down a little bit of glue and then fire everything together with some pocket hole screws. I fully admit, yes, I am more than likely over-engineering and overbuilding this clamp rack, but parallel clamps are super heavy. This rack can hold up to 25 clamps, which will be close to 175 pounds. Now with that piece super solid and locked in with those pocket hole screws, I can take a little bit more glue, apply it to this back panel here, and then stick these 2 pieces together. And it really doesn't take that much more effort to reinforce everything with some extra glue and screws. From the back side, I'll blast in a few screws real quick to hold these pieces together before grabbing my drill to pre-drill and countersink some slightly deeper holes. I'm making sure to drive these screws into those sections that are going to be holding the weight of the clamps, again, just for extra reinforcement. There's absolutely no way this thing is falling apart. So now that we've got the back piece on and it looks pretty solid, the next thing that we need to do is grab the upper shelf piece and attach it right here. And as you can probably guess, that means more pocket holes. I just realized I forgot to tell everybody that I started a podcast with Zach from Zach Builds. We answer all your woodworking questions and have a great time. So if you want to check out that podcast, it's down in the description below. Now back to pocket holes. If you've ever had any questions that you wanted me to give a long and detailed response to, email them to offthecutpodcast@gmail.com and we will answer them on the air. Now, one thing to be aware of when you go to attach this top shelf is that if you're going to put your clamps up in a really high location, put the shelves with the pocket holes facing up. That way you'll never see them. But if it's going to be in a low location where you're actually going to use that top shelf pretty often, do it this way. That way the pocket holes are hidden. Sometimes it's the simple things that make a big difference in the builds. With the main structure of the clamp rack finished, the next thing that I need to do is cut down pieces for the sides. And just to change things up, I grabbed my crosscut sled, link in the description for that video, and well, I ran into an issue. Honestly, I feel like an idiot sometimes. I was making this cut here and dust collection pipe got in the way. We all make mistakes. Seriously though, you are not the only one who makes silly mistakes in the wood shop. Everyone does it and it's totally normal. Don't beat yourself up and think that people on YouTube are perfect because they're definitely not. Or at least that's just me. To get those side pieces to their final dimension, I grabbed my miter gauge with built-in stop block and first ensured that the edge was perfectly squared at 90 degrees before lowering the stop block down and butting the workpiece up against it. I don't care how accurate you think you are, using a stop block will always give you more consistent results and make it super easy to make repetitive cuts. With those side pieces cut, I also need to cut a 30-degree angle right about here. This 30-degree angle can also easily be achieved by setting the miter gauge to one of its preset angles. A touch more wood glue on the ends, and then I can align the pieces before clamping them in place. But I don't have any clamps that are 50 some inches long, so these pocket hole clamps really come in handy for situations like this. Just insert them into the hole and get a super secure fit. Then just drive the screws home. To help protect the clamp rack from clamps banging against it over time, I'm going to apply some satin finish using some Total Boat Halcyon. Instead of covering the entire project with the satin finish, what you actually want to do is start with about 2 to 3 coats of the gloss and then put the satin on top of it. That's because the satin finish has some flattening agents in it that'll make the finish just a little bit cloudy if you applied tons and tons of layers, whereas the gloss doesn't. Hopefully that was a helpful tip, but you probably don't want to watch me spray all this, so I'm going to start with the gloss and then we can just get it mounted on the wall. The wall mounting really could not be any easier. Just fire some screws through the back, obviously making sure to hit studs, and this bad boy's done. Once again, I want to remind you that there are free plans linked down below so that you can build this clamp rack for yourself to make sure that you stay perfectly organized in your shop. Don't have a bunch of fancy parallel clamps? This design works for smaller F-style clamps too. The great thing about that clamp rack is it is so versatile and will work with tons of different brands, types, and styles of clamps. Plus, having a designated space for everything to go makes sure that you will actually clean things up and keep your shop relatively neat and tidy. And remember, there are plans linked down below so that you can build one for yourself. Next up is a project that I know tons of people need to do and is one of my most used tools in the shop. The awesome thing is that you can build this as an add-on to virtually any table saw on the market, and it only requires a super minimal investment in materials. I truly don't know why more people don't build them. I don't want to spoil the surprise, so let's jump into my next favorite shop project. After having this table saw for almost 2 years, it's finally time to do something about the biggest problem. These extension wings are made from really cheap, crappy metal, and they flex like crazy. Not to mention that on this side of the table saw, the wing only comes out a couple inches and leaves this massive gap right on the side where things always fall down. So today I'm going to show you how you can replace that crappy metal wing on your Delta or Rigid table saw and make your own built-in router table with router lift. This has been one of those builds that's been on my to-do list for well over a year. Every single time I look at this table saw, it drives me nuts to see that giant gap on the side. I can't set anything down over there like extra pieces that I need to cut because everything just falls through. Plus, I recently have been doing a massive purge.
This is not a test. This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual purge
Of tons and tons of tools that I no longer have a use for or just cluttering up my space. Like that router table behind me. I have no need for a floor standing router table, so I'm selling that one and replacing it with this inline router table for my table saw. To make sure this thing is rock solid, I'm not using your standard plywood that you'd find at the big box store. Instead, I'm using Baltic birch plywood. This is substantially more expensive, but it has about twice as many plies, which makes it much more dense and much more stable. Plus, it will resist sagging and warping over time. So it took probably 2-3 passes to get the size of this perfectly dialed in, but you want it to be where it'll slide between those rails and it is nice and tight. As you can see, not holding it at all, this thing's holding itself. So now that I got the main piece that's gonna make up the table, I can go ahead and cut down some supports just to make this a little more rigid. So what you've seen me do so far is work on cutting a piece that will act as the main platform for the router table. I should mention that I'm not sharing any specifics on exact measurements in this video because I've got free plans for this project linked down in the description below. So now that I have all the pieces cut down that are going to make up that router table extension, I'm just gonna grab my pocket hole jig and connect everything together. Pocket holes are a super strong and easy way to attach all the pieces together, but it truly does not matter at all what technique you use here. If you do decide to use pocket holes though, one tip I have is to clamp everything together before driving in the screws. Pocket holes have a tendency to shift the pieces when they're being driven in, and the clamps just help prevent that. Also, applying or not applying glue doesn't really matter either, but I tend to err on the side of overbuilding something, so I like the extra strength that glue adds, but it's up to you. So now the extension wing is made, we can grab it and head over to the table saw. In order to figure out where to drill the mounting locations, I removed the fence rail and popped out the old extension wing, as well as whatever this useless piece here is. This bad boy fits in here, but remember, you want it to be slightly on the snug side. Instead of taking forever and measuring out all of the mounting holes, I just mark things with a pen. Easy. So with those holes marked out, you 100% could just grab your drill and go ahead and drill those holes.
That's what she said.
Michael, please.
But I want to show you something slightly easier. Now, I don't own a drill press or one of those fancy jigs that basically turns your drill into like a portable drill press, but I got something else that'll work pretty well. And I'm talking about this new Craig drilling guide that has 6 different size holes to keep that drill bit perfectly straight as you drill down into the wood. So if I'm trying to drill this hole, I just place the guide with a corresponding collar over the hole, grab my drill, and get a perfectly straight hole drilled. I feel like I said drill a lot. So being able to drill those holes with perfect 90s is nice, but there's something that you absolutely cannot do with a handheld drill, and that's doing kind of offset holes. So having the hole just like that is going to be fine because the bolt can go in. However, I want to have a little bit of side-to-side adjustment to get this perfectly level, so I really kind of want to drill out something like this. And if you have ever attempted to do that with just a handheld drill, you know that it does not work. So what I can do is take the drilling guide and set it on top of that with it being slightly offset and go ahead and drill the holes out again. And yeah, I'll save you the comment. You could do this with a router too. And then they turn out perfect like that. So after getting that table reinstalled on the side and it's nice and perfectly level, you could absolutely just stop here and got yourself a nice big table saw wing. However, I want to add a router table lift into it, so let's do that next. Now to get the router lift into the extension wing, you 100% could just grab a jigsaw, cut out the outline and pop it in there. However, it's not going to get you super accurate, and I have a much simpler way to do it. I want the lift to go right about here. So I quickly marked out the rough location with a pencil, and I want to remove this interior space right here. Now I know what you're thinking, Eric, just use a template to route out the perfect spot for that router lift. Well, here's the problem. This router lift does not, at least that I could find, have any templates available anywhere. So what we're gonna do is grab some 1/4-inch plywood, and I'm gonna show you how you can make a template. So I already made a template earlier just as a proof of concept, and as you can see, it fits perfectly around the router lift. To get started, I just need some double-sided tape and a few scrap pieces of wood. I can then stick these pieces down around the lift, making sure that things are snug, but not too snug. And because those scrap pieces make up the boundary of the router lift, I know that I want to remove all of the material inside. I'll quickly drill some entry holes in each corner of the template and then grab my jigsaw to cut everything out. Now, when you do this step, it should look pretty rough. You are not looking to get close to the edge because that's what this next step is for. This is a massive flush trim bit that has a bearing that's the exact same radius on the corners as the router plate. So when I run this bearing along the wood, it will perfectly follow the guides and cut that 1/4-inch plywood to the exact size below. And with a bit this large, you definitely want to ensure that you are routing in the correct direction so you don't get some nasty kickback. Also, make sure to dial that speed of the router bit down because this thing is a big bit, so it'll spin real fast. Just put it on like 2 or something, that's fine. Once everything is routed out, I can easily pop off those scrap pieces held down by the double-sided tape, and you can see that the router fits absolutely perfect inside that template. Cool beans.
So with that template made, I now know that the cutout that I'm gonna have on the extension wing is going to be the perfect size. So to start the template process, I'll just start by drilling a couple holes.
Now you're probably thinking that this is absolutely overkill. And yeah, you're probably right. But I'm gonna be looking at this every single day, so I want it to fit perfectly and actually look nice. So once again, I'll grab the jigsaw and I'll rough cut the shape of the router lift, making sure to stay right about 1/8 of an inch away from the line. And to hold that template down, let's just say that you don't have any double-sided tape, no problem. You can cover all the edges of the workpiece with some painter's tape, and then do the exact same thing with painter's tape over on the template. Then you just need to squeeze a little bit of super glue on one surface, and then spray some activator on the opposing surface. Once you press the two together and hold it for about a second or two, you'll get a permanent and instant bond. Over on my trim router, I grabbed a template bit which had a bearing on the top. That way the bearing can ride along the template and copy the perfect shape onto the surface below. Now the only template bit that I have is really small, so I had to take 2 passes, slowly working my way down to route out the entire thickness of that 3/4 inch plywood. As you can see, that makeshift double-sided tape held things together perfectly. Just peel it off and you're good to go.
So now that I've got that spot in the extension wing routed out, is gonna be a perfect fit. We'll just take a couple taps just to make sure it's seated in there. So that is held in fairly securely. However, I want to be able to balance this and get it perfectly locked in there.
Craig makes these handy dandy insert plate levelers that go into each corner of the cutout. Just secure them from underneath with a few screws, and then use these set screws to adjust the plate to the perfect level.
Now before we're totally wrapped up with this thing, we definitely need to finish this because it's gonna be on the table saw and get banged up like crazy. And because filming against something that's really light in color, I made a mistake with my workbench, is really difficult, I'm going to actually dye this tabletop black with a little bit of black India ink.
I went with India ink instead of paint because this stuff dries super fast. And it's all that I had lying around, if I'm being honest. So to make sure the surface was super durable, I grabbed some of this Total Boat tabletop epoxy and poured it all over the surface. This stuff is really thin, so it'll automatically self-level. You just have to give it a little bit of encouragement with a plastic spreader, and then a little bit of guidance with a heat gun. It's pretty easy.
Now I will say that this epoxy came out way too glossy for my liking, so I grabbed a white Scotch-Brite pad and then scratched up the surface just to make everything a little bit more dull. And to make this nice and slick, I took a little bit of paste wax, rubbed it all over the surface of the entire saw, let it dry, and then buffed it out to a nice satin sheen. I've already used this setup a ton, and it has saved me tons of floor space by getting rid of that floor standing router table. But let's address a few things that I know people are gonna ask. First, what about a fence for the router table? Yes, I know that I need to make one that has like some split openings so you can bury the bits and everything in there, but I'm gonna be making that on a future video because this one's already getting a little long. I'm thinking about making one that slots over my table saw fence. That way I can quickly and easily add it or take it off whenever I don't need it. But I'm truly curious, if there are any things that you think I should consider into adding into a router table fence, let me know. And the other glaring issue is, what about dust collection? As you can see, there is already a boatload of dust underneath the router table, and I'm definitely gonna be making a video on how to improve that. I'm thinking about making some sort of box that goes all the way around the router that I can just plug my dust collector into, as well as a spot up on top of the fence that will collect the dust from the top, obviously. Isn't it crazy that with just a few pieces of plywood, you can create a perfect router table built directly into your table saw? Again, there are plans linked down in the description for you to build one of these for yourself. Now, having a router table built into your table saw instead of having a freestanding one in your shop is a massive space saver. Because if you're anything like me, space is at a huge premium. The only problem with routers is that they create a ton of dust. But like I hinted at the end of that project, I didn't address the dust collection concerns, so let's jump into how to solve that. A few weeks ago, I made this router table extension for my table saw, and it has been absolutely perfect, except one small thing. Because the router has nothing surrounding it underneath the table, the dust goes absolutely everywhere and is making a giant mess. Now sure, there are already tons of commercial products like these that definitely would work. However, they're really expensive, and as a woodworker, I can build my own stuff, right? So today, let's grab some plywood and some basic tools and build out this router table extension so it has perfect dust collection. As far as materials go, you truly can make this out of whatever you want. I just had some scrap plywood laying around that's 5/8 inches thick, so that's what I'm gonna be using. And whenever I'm using scraps like this, I always like to take a second to take the plans that I have and try to figure out the most efficient way to cut everything down so I don't waste more material than I need to. Speaking of those plans, if you want to build this project for yourself, I'll leave a link down below in the description where you can download everything that you need for this project. And if you're curious to learn more about any of the tools that you see me using during this video, there is an exhaustive list of everything down below, including links for you to learn more about all of the tools. Overall, this project seems really simple, but simple projects are where you can also make some big mistakes. For example, if you just assume that all the corners of the plywood are perfectly square, sure, you could make all of your cuts using the rip fence. But in order for the box to go together perfectly, utilizing a crosscut sled like this one that I built a while back ensures that all of your pieces are cut precisely and you're not stuck fumbling around with pieces that don't actually have 90-degree corners on them. But instead of watching me cut down plywood, let's jump into SketchUp to see how this is all going to come together. So here's a digital depiction of my table saw. Over here, that's where I put the router table extension in a few weeks ago. So underneath, I need to make up a box that allows me to capture all of the dust that the router generates. So let's isolate that box to make things just a little bit clearer. There we go. Alright, so this is super simple. There are really only 3 different size pieces that you need to cut. 1 bottom panel, 2 side panels, and 2 front or back panels. Just depends on how you look at them. And I guess that's it, but things will get a touch more intricate later on in the video, so let's just jump back into the shop. So with all those pieces cut down that are gonna make the dust collection box that goes underneath the router table, it's time to just put the box together. And yes, there are 1,000 ways to put together a box. You could use dominoes, biscuits, brad nails, just glue, whatever you want. But what I'm gonna use today, and to make this go faster so I can finally get this project done, I'm just gonna use some pocket holes. The comment section of YouTube videos is always full of people proclaiming that one joinery method is superior to another. But when it comes to building a simple shop project, especially one that will never be subjected to any force,
See, nobody cares.
it's completely irrelevant what you use. There is no sense in being a gatekeeper trying to tell certain people that they are or they are not a woodworker because of the joinery methods that they use. As long as you are enjoying what you are building, use whatever joinery method you want. Just have fun with this stuff. Once all of the pocket holes are drilled in, it's time to connect the panels together with some pocket hole screws. One inconvenience about using pocket hole screws is that since they attach at an angle, they do have a tendency to shift the pieces slightly out of alignment. But this can easily be fixed by clamping everything together before driving in those screws. So next time you're using pocket holes, try this method and let me know how it works for you.
Whew. All right, so after putting that box all together, you'll probably notice that there's no front on it yet, and that's because I'm gonna do that step probably last. The front is gonna have a little piece that goes right about here, and I'm gonna cut this in half. That way the bottom of it can fold down and you can reach inside to adjust the speed of the router and everything like that. But while the box is still open and that front isn't on yet, I wanna focus my attention on the back side right here. I picked up this dust collection port and I want to add this onto the back of the router box. That way I can just take my dust collection hose, connect them together and get perfect dust collection. So obviously I already marked out lines to make sure this thing's perfectly centered, and I can just place it on here and then take my pencil and mark out the inside.
I grabbed just some random sized drill bit and drilled a few holes into the back of the box so that my jigsaw blade has a place to cleanly start the cut. If you've ever tried cutting veneer plywood like this with a jigsaw and experienced some really bad tear out, that's likely because you have the orbital action on your jigsaw turned all the way up. That effectively makes the cut really aggressive and it makes it faster. However, that causes a ton of tear out. My tip is take that orbital action and turn it all the way down. Yes, it'll make the saw cut much slower, but as you can see, there is no tear out. And this is a really old blade too. And for even more accuracy, stick your tongue out, because my girlfriend noticed that every time I'm trying to focus on something, I do this. I love the taste of sawdust.
So with the hole in the back of the dust box cut out, I could definitely just take the dust port, put it on top, and fire a couple screws in. But you're not a real worker unless you absolutely overcomplicate and overdesign everything that you make, right? So to make sure that this is sealed super well, I'm first gonna take some black silicone caulk and put it all around the seams here. That way there's absolutely no air loss. And this tube's just about to expire and I don't want it to go to waste.
This caulk is 100% unnecessary. I honestly just hate to see things go to waste, so I figured instead of tossing this in the trash, I might as well try to tighten up some seams, right? That caulk, whoops, meant to say caulk, not cock. That's embarrassing. That caulk will cause the dust collection fitting to slide around a bit, so after holding it down with a few clamps, I drilled some holes through the fitting and the box that allow me to throw some bolts in and securely fasten everything together. It's completely over-engineered and I love every second of it. And yes, I know that I'm not good at working with caulk. Gotta be careful what I say there, but no one's ever gonna see this. It's the inside of a box.
So now that the main box is all constructed, what I need to do next is focus my attention on making that door. And that door is gonna be right here on the front of the router table. That way I can easily reach underneath the table and have access to changing the speed of the router depending on what size bit that I'm using. And for a lot of people, adding a door to something like this tends to be a little complicated or intimidating if you've never done it. But I wanna show you a super easy way that works every time. The first thing that you're gonna wanna do is cut a panel down. That way it fits over the front of the box just like you're completely closing it off. Then on the front of that panel, grab a pencil and mark out where you want that cut line to be. This is where you're gonna split the panel into two separate pieces. Then over at my table saw, I'm gonna set that piece down so that that blade is gonna cut perfectly down that line, and I'll adjust my fence.
Where exactly you cut this panel is honestly irrelevant as long as it creates a gap wide enough for you to fit your hand in. But mine was roughly 4.5 inches if you really want to know.
So that cut is going to leave you with two separate pieces. The bottom piece is going to be the piece that I actually want to have fold down for the door, and then the top piece is going to go right here. So with the top piece secured to the box, I want this piece to basically fold down right like that.
And I've got these hinges that are gonna go right here and right here to allow that to happen. Hinges may seem like a nightmare, but Craig makes tons of jigs like this concealed hinge jig and automated clamp that make the process effortless. Just twist on the drill cup, chuck up your drill out the hole, remove the cup, pre-drill the screw locations, remove the jig, and you've got yourself perfectly dialed in spots for your hinges. It's easy. These hinges are securely held in place with 2 small screws on each side, and they operate perfectly. To attach them to the main box, I'll line up the door and using a fancy self-centering drill bit thing, drill some small pilot holes before securing the hinges down with some small screws. And now you've got yourself a perfectly functioning door.
Hold up just a second. I know this question's gonna get asked about why did I put the hinges so close to the middle and not go more out towards the side? And that's because I already kind of anticipate the dust collection not being perfect on this. And so one of my thoughts is that I can put some angled pieces here to make this not have such sharp corners where the dust is gonna get stuck into. So by putting those hinges more towards the middle, I can add this in the future if I need to. I knew you were gonna ask.
This door is obviously going to be pretty hard to open, so I'm gonna stick a handle on right about here. Craig makes this super simple cabinet hardware jig thing that aligns to the dead center of your door and has collars that guide your drill bit to drill a hole in the perfect spot. Just run the included hardware with the handle through the backside, tighten everything down, and you've got yourself a perfectly functioning door. Bingo. Now that that dust collection box is about done, I can attach... crap. I didn't think about the power cord. Sometimes the simple things really do slip my mind, but I can fix that with a little drum sander attachment thing on my drill and carve out a recess for the power cord. Alright, attempt number 2. Cord goes here, a few pocket hole screws to secure it to the table, and we are in business. Just connect the hose to the back, and you can see that I can easily reach in to adjust the speed whenever I need to.
So now that I've got that dust collection box hooked up underneath the router table, I know the question is gonna be, how good's the dust collection? So let's test it.
And I do want to say that if you're ever giving your router table this much dust at one time, you're probably doing something wrong. But I wanted to simulate a really intensive task to see if the system actually worked. The throat plate obviously limited the amount of dust that could be sucked up, so after removing it, this thing took dust like a champ.
So with all the sawdust collected through this router table box, let's take a look inside to see what it looks like.
So as you can see, there's still quite a lot of dust here that's kind of collected around the corners and the sides. So what I think I'm gonna do is try to put some braces in all these corners to help push all of this more towards the center. But before I do that, the one thing that I noticed is the air sounds weird. It sounds like it's being restricted. So I'm thinking I might actually adjust the hinges to open up this gap between the door here. That way the air has a little bit more room to escape. Will that help? I have no idea, but let's try it. I guarantee there's somebody down in the comments that knows much more about fluid dynamics than I do, but the small amount of research I did said that actually creating a little gap for air to escape might help. Anyway, I grabbed some scrap pieces that I had and ripped 45-degree angles on each side. This will allow the pieces to meet in the corners of the dust collection box and hopefully give a smooth pass for the dust and air to travel. I have no idea. So I can pop those pieces in right about here, and because I had the idea of locating the hinges towards the inside, there was no interference. When it was all said and done, it turned out to look like this hot mess. Again, I don't care that it looks awful. This is the inside of a dust collection box. Let's get this attached back underneath the table and see if the adjustments that I made make any difference. The first thing that I noticed is that adjusting that hinge to create a little bit more of a gap between the two pieces eliminated that really obnoxious whistling noise and seemed like it actually increased the suction. I know that I don't have any sort of quantitative observation, but it definitely felt stronger. So let's see how that bottom looks. Underneath the router, there is substantially less dust. Yes, some of it stuck to the silicone caulk, but I'm totally okay with this performance. And there's also a little pile underneath the router, but not bad at all.
I think I forgot to mention that I also put this power switch right here on the wall so I can easily start and easily stop the router without having to breach underneath. This simple dust box underneath the router table has made a massive improvement in my dust collection efforts. And while I do have the bottom of the router covered, I know you're gonna ask, what about the top? Well, to be honest with you, because the dust collection on the bottom of the router table is so good and so strong, I truly do not get a lot of buildup on the top of the table when I'm doing a lot of routing. But that hasn't stopped me from working on this prototype router fence. I know it doesn't look very good right now, but I'm working on making a router fence that'll slot over top of my existing table saw fence. It'll be able to connect another dust hose to the top to really increase that dust collection. I am no pro when it comes to complex physics like fluid dynamics, but that dust box captured a huge amount of dust around the router table, and my dust collector isn't even very good. I can only imagine how well it would work with a proper dust collector. And for the fence, I honestly still have the exact same scrap pieces of wood whenever I need to bury a bit in the fence. I've found that the dust collection is more than enough from underneath, and that having a custom fence on top really isn't all that necessary for me. It's definitely something that you could work on, but I didn't really find it necessary to devote all of that time when these scraps have always worked fine for me. And yes, there are plans for that dust box linked down in the description below too. Between working my day job, running this business, shopping for our first home and everything else life throws at me, meal planning, grocery shopping, and cooking can be a huge hassle. But that's where Hungryroot comes in. Hungryroot sends me fresh, high-quality groceries and simple, delicious recipes every week, allowing me to focus on what I love doing, not stressing about my groceries. It's like having someone else do all the planning and shopping, so I don't even have to think about it. The great thing is that Hungryroot gets to know all of your personal health goals, dietary restrictions, favorite foods, and more. Then they build you a personalized cart with all of your groceries for the week. From snacks and smoothies to high-quality meats and seafood, Hungryroot provides me with everything I need each week, and their 4-ingredient recipes are super easy to make. The first 100 people to use my code, Spencley40, will get 40% off their first grocery order with Hungryroot. Use the link in the show notes or scan the QR code and use code Spencley40 to get 40% off. Next up is something that every single woodworker needs, without question, to build anything: a rock-solid workbench. Only problem is that all the videos here on YouTube assume you already have a workbench to build a workbench. That doesn't make any sense. Let's jump into how to make a great beginner workbench with only 2 basic tools and a single sheet of plywood. Every woodworker needs a workbench, but not every woodworker has a shop full of tools to build one. So how in the world are you supposed to follow all these YouTube videos showing you how to build a simple workbench when you're just getting started out and only own 2 cheap tools? Well, that's where I come in. Hi, I'm Eric Spencley, and I'm going to show you how to build this rock-solid workbench using only 2 of the cheapest tools that I could find at the home center: a drill and a circular saw. Before we get started, here's what you'll need to pick up at the home center to build this. You need 1 sheet of 3/4 inch thick plywood and some 1 1/4 inch long screws. Yeah, that's it. Seriously, I told you that this project was very doable. And when you arrive at the home center, you'll walk down the plywood aisle
and be greeted by an insane selection of warped, wavy Lay's potato chips. You want to stay clear of those and avoid them at all costs. I know that you're like me and you're really cheap, and your spouse probably reminds you of it every day, but trust me, you do not want that crap for your workbench. Instead, be judgmental and pick out the most expensive sheet of plywood that your home center has. For me, it's this stuff called sanded plywood at about $75 a sheet. If you can't find the label, it should be pretty easy to spot because it's the only one that's reasonably flat. Now, you're up for the real challenge, and that's attempting to find one of these carts to load your plywood on. Once you've acquired that rare lumber cart, head on out to the parking lot because if your store is anything like mine, the panel saw in the back of the store has been mysteriously broken for over 3 years. And even if yours is functional, I wish you the best of luck getting one of the angry workers to cut down a sheet for you.
Hi there. Is there a project you're working on?
I know more than you.
All right.
Oh, and before you leave, pick up some of these 1 1/4 inch long screws. My pickup truck hasn't gone through puberty yet, so there's no way that I'm gonna get this massive 4 foot by 8 foot sheet home without cutting it down. I bring with me some pieces of foam insulation, scraps of wood or sawhorses to lay my sheet of plywood down on the ground before grabbing my circular saw out of the trunk and getting some super weird stares from people in the parking lot. I'm using this Craig rip guide attachment that makes it super simple to get accurate cuts without the need to measure so that I can quickly get home. But you 100% do not need this, and I'll show you more when we get back to the shop. With that panel cut down, I can easily pop both of the pieces of plywood inside my truck, as well as the foam pieces, and don't forget the circular saw. I'll use some ratchet straps to secure all of the plywood in my truck so that it won't move as I'm driving. Now, I literally live 2 blocks away from the home center, so I don't need to really go crazy here. But if you are getting on the highway, make sure that you pretty much go overboard with the straps and make sure that things are really locked down. Now, let's get out of here before I get some weird stares. Back at home, I can release the straps and get all of the plywood safely inside my shop. And what's the purpose of me showing you all of that? I want to make this accessible to everyone watching, so you can see that even with a prepubescent truck, you can make this project too. Now that I've got the plywood at home, I can start breaking it down into smaller pieces for the workbench. And before I get too far, I do want to let you know that you can download this for yourself down in the description below. Oh, and because I realize that you are probably building a workbench because you don't have one, I'm gonna be doing this entire thing on the floor. Since I don't want the blade of my circular saw to dig into the concrete floor, I laid down those same sheets of foam insulation to give me a safe place to cut into. Like I said in the parking lot, you do not need that special circular saw guide for this project. You can 100% just raw dog it and rely on your eyes and hands to guide the saw along your cut line. Now with just a little bit of patience, you can pretty accurately rip down all the strips that you need with just using a circular saw. However, if you want to have your circular saw be a little bit more accurate, a little bit more repeatable, and not rely on the steadiness of your hands, that's where this comes into play. And that's this Craig rip guide. This is super simple. It's just an arm piece and this sled base piece thing. The sled will slide onto the arm, and then you can easily lock it down to whatever specific measurement that you need. Then take any circular saw, even the cheapest one that I could find at the home center, and it clamps down with 2 screws. Now, without needing to measure or make sure that my hand is perfectly guiding the saw, I just rip a strip that is the perfect width every time. Here's a clip that's in real time to give you an idea of how fast you can rip an 8-foot long strip, even with a very underpowered circular saw. The next strip that I need is slightly larger, so I can quickly adjust the measurement on the guide to dial in the exact measurement that I need. Now, a table saw would 100% be much faster at doing this, but the intent of this video is to show you that you can make virtually every project that I make with very limited tools. All that buying more expensive tools does is allow you to accomplish tasks faster and more repeatable. I can do almost the exact same things with the circular saw as I do with my table saw. One last adjustment on the guide, and I can rip down my final strips for this workbench. You'll also notice that there is dust everywhere as I make these cuts. That's where people start becoming obsessed with dust collection. But at this stage in your woodworking game, you're not there quite yet. With all of those main strips cut down according to those free plans, let's quickly jump into SketchUp so you can better understand how this workbench is going to come together, and you can actually follow what I'm up to instead of just watching me mindlessly cut down pieces of the plywood. So here's a digital rendering of what I want the workbench to look like. To make things easy, let's separate the build into 3 main parts: the 4 legs, the shelf brackets, and the shelf panels. Each leg is going to be made up of a 4-inch wide piece and a 3¼ inch wide piece joined together at a 90-degree angle. Inside of those 4 legs, there are going to be 2 shelf brackets that hold everything together. On top of that lower shelf, I'll plop on a panel to give me a super strong lower shelf for holding tools and stuff. And then on the top bracket, I'll put that last piece of plywood to act as my workbench top. Hopefully that clears things up and makes it a little bit easier to follow along with what I'm doing. So let's get back to building. So with that larger sheet of plywood broken down into some more manageable strips, I want to start on the workbench by focusing on making the legs. So I'm going to grab these 4-inch strips and cut them down. These legs need to be cut to about 35¼ inch long. To make sure my pieces are identical, I stack one strip on top of another and make a super simple crosscut with my circular saw. And while there is absolutely nothing wrong with just taking your circular saw and guiding it across by hand, if you want to get your cuts to be super accurate, try using a speed square or this crosscut guide. What this does is create a perfectly straight edge for your circular saw to run against, which takes all of the guesswork and accuracy problems out of play. You just make the cut and you've got perfectly straight edges for your legs. So now I've got these 4 leg pieces here that are 4-inch wide pieces, and then I can grab some of those other strips and rip down the other pieces for the legs. After measuring the length of the legs again, I like to use my speed square to transfer a straight line across the boards just to make sure that my cut is in fact perfectly straight. I also like to clamp my boards together to make sure that they don't shift during the cut, which would throw my accuracy way off. It might seem time consuming, but all these little extra steps really make sure that your pieces are as accurate as possible, and that will make the assembly of the workbench substantially easier. So now that I've got all 8 of those leg pieces, I can start the process of joining them together. To make the legs, we're just gonna take one of the thicker strips and one of the thinner strips and join them together to make a simple butt joint. Just grab some screws and drive them into the edge of the board, trying to stay as close to the center as possible. But chances are, you'll run into a little issue like I did here and then over here too. But this is entirely preventable. Now, one method to prevent the screws from blowing out the wood is to pre-drill and countersink your holes. This is a special bit that makes a guide hole for the screw to go into, and also a little recess spot on the top for the head of the screw to sit inside. It definitely takes a little more time, but it prevents the wood from splitting out on you, which never looks good. Now, there is absolutely no issue if you want to make your legs like this, but what do you do if you don't want to have all the exposed hardware? Well, I've got a super simple method, and perhaps you've heard of it before. It's called pocket holes. This is the cheapest, most basic pocket hole jig, and it comes with a special drill bit. All you have to do is clamp the small jig onto your workpiece, insert that special drill bit into the jig, and drill out the hole. The metal stop collar there lets you know how far to drill in, so you literally can't mess it up. After removing the jig, you've got this neat little pocket here. Now just repeat the entire way down the board, and you can start driving those pocket hole screws in place. So that's a pretty easy way to make sure that there's no visible hardware on the outside of the leg. However, this is the first pocket hole jig that I bought about 3 years ago, and since then, there is a much faster way to do this. This pocket hole jig literally does the exact same thing as the cheaper one that I showed you previously. The only difference is speed. Just grab your leg piece, clamp it down with the auto-adjusting clamp, and then grab your drill to drill out the pocket hole. You can instantly tell how much easier this upgraded jig makes things. Not to mention, it solves the dust collection issue that I talked about earlier. And like I said, it accomplishes the exact same thing. A few more pocket hole screws can be plopped inside those pockets, and I can drive home the screws to secure the leg pieces together. So it's probably pretty clear that this was a substantially faster way to put the leg together, but both methods are still exactly the same. The only difference is the speed. And if you want to go even faster,
now, is there anyone out there who wants to go fast? Anybody?
I want to go fast. Check this out. This is something that I picked up about a week ago, and it's made pocket holes even faster. I literally just pull this handle and it does all of the work for me. And again, you get the exact same outcome with the pockets, it just takes a fraction of the time. Grab some more screws, plop them into the pockets, and then drive them home to create that fourth leg. So now with all 4 of those legs put together, let's set these down and focus our attention on making these shelves. The purpose of me showing you all those different methods for assembling the legs was not to bore you or flex on all the different tools that I have. It's to show you that regardless of what you have access to, you can very easily make all of the projects that I show on my channel. The only thing that you gain by buying a more expensive version of a tool is speed and accuracy. If using a circular saw and speed square takes way too much time for you, jumping up to a miter saw accomplishes the exact same thing. The only difference, again, is that a miter saw is faster and more accurate. When I started out, I would watch other YouTube channels with tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tools in their shop and think to myself that the only way I can build what they're building is if I also have those tools. This video is proof that even with very, very modest tools, you can build exactly what I built. And after cutting all of these pieces, we've got pretty much all the pieces cut down, ready to build the shelves for the bench. These brackets are going to be assembled with simple butt joints like this. Now, just like with the leg, you could absolutely just take some screws and fire them through the outside. However, I want to make things look a little cleaner, so I'm going to take these pieces here and throw in some pocket holes. I'll leave a link down in the description below for you to pick up these plans. With all of those pocket holes drilled out, let's grab those pieces and start assembling the shelves. Actually, I think I'm gonna go inside and get some tacos. I'll finish this tomorrow.
The next morning.
All right, well, let's get back to building that workbench. Real quick, I want to interrupt and answer a question that I commonly get in the comments section, and that's, where did I come up with the design or inspiration for this build? Well, the first requirement that I set for myself was because I wanted this to be approachable. I wanted it to be that you only need 2 really budget entry-level tools to build this. And second, I didn't want anyone to have to go buy tons of material, so I wanted this thing to be made with 1 single sheet of plywood. And for the design, well, it's literally just a wooden version of the metal bench that I have now. But let's get back to the build. You know what? I just realized I have no way to attach this to the top unless I put some pocket hole screws in here. Well, I guess gotta gather up these pieces and put in some more pocket hole screws. No big deal. Here's the truth about woodworking videos you see on YouTube. It may seem like creators never make a single mistake, and that since you make mistakes on your projects, that you're a failure. That literally could not be further from the truth. On every single project that I make mistakes and forget to do things.
All right, now we're good.
It is normal and it is part of your growth as a woodworker. Every single one of us makes mistakes. Just have fun building and don't compare yourself to others. These pieces are going to go together like this, but my floor is nowhere near flat, and having a flat surface will make things 100 times easier, so I'm going to use this large piece of plywood that I have left over to create a flat work surface for myself. The other thing that makes driving these pocket hole screws together much easier is if you use some clamps to hold the pieces tightly together. Pocket holes have a tendency to make pieces shift as the screws are being driven in, and the clamps help prevent that, which makes your life way easier. And with one shelf bracket done, I can repeat the exact same steps to create another bracket. Oh, have you heard about the podcast I started with my friend Zach from Zach Builds? It's called Off the Cut, and every week we hang out and talk about what we're working on, behind the scenes stuff.
Like little things that keep happening, and those views theoretically should be just as valuable for the sponsor, but nobody wants to pay you for those.
How to grow your business, and even have guests like Jonathan Katz-Moses on to tell hilarious stories.
Jason Grissom wants to know, can you share a time from your younger years that you look back on and think, what in the hell was I doing? Anybody got one?
Oh, is this for everybody?
Sure.
I got a good one.
Oh,
go
man,
for it.
okay. Yeah, go for it.
If you're interested in checking out the show, it's available on every streaming platform, and there's a link down in the description below. All right, so now that that second shelf bracket is screwed together, that was hard to say, let's cut down this last panel of plywood and make the tops for both the shelves. To cut down the large panel for the bottom shelf, I'll first lay down the shelf bracket that I just made and mark where I need to cut this larger panel. I honestly don't care what the plans say, because if I messed up earlier and my brackets are slightly smaller or slightly larger than they're supposed to be, the plans are pretty much useless here. Instead, I use a referential measurement and I can cut the panel to the exact size that I need. A few more clamps and I can drive all the screws to hold on the shelf securely. Now let's get to the good part, the final assembly of the bench. I again use one last scrap piece of plywood I've got as a flat surface to work off of before grabbing two legs and setting them down. I can then set the top shelf bracket in place and secure it to the leg with 4 screws. One tip I have here is to offset the screws from one another to help keep things as secure as possible. With the top bracket in place, I can plop the bottom shelf in place. It really doesn't matter what height from the bottom the shelf is put at, but I did about 10 inches from the bottom of the leg. Again, drive 4 more screws into each leg, and we've got the start of a workbench. While I continue on attaching the legs to the workbench, if you made it this far in the video, leave a comment down below that says hot dog. Starting your question or comment off with the word hot dog lets me know that you actually watched the video, and the engagement is a massive help in growing my channel and getting it out to even more people. And if you really want to help support my goal of quitting my day job and taking this channel full time, consider becoming a Patreon member. Patreon is where you get to watch every video before it's released to the public. This video, for example, my patrons got to see 3 weeks before it was live here on YouTube. You can also pick up plans or merch from my website too, but as always, there's absolutely no pressure, so let's just get back to the build. All right, flip this thing over. Now let's get that top cut down. We got ourselves a workbench. The great thing now is that since we've got a workbench to build on, I can trim the top to its final size using the workbench. And it is much easier than working on the floor. Uh-oh, I made another mistake. Well, it helps if I actually have the depth on my circular saw set correctly. All right, let's try that again. This is what I mean. Literally everyone makes mistakes. You definitely could just leave the top oversized so it hangs over the edge of the workbench, but I want mine to be nice and flush. So the last thing I need to do is trim the length of the top before flipping the workbench over and attaching the top with some more pocket hole screws. I can already predict the comments saying that this workbench isn't going to be strong enough and that it's just going to collapse as soon as any weight is put on it. Well, I weigh about 210 pounds and it can easily support me jumping on top of it. And to prove it's strong enough, here you go. That's all I got for this one, and I'll see you on the next one. That workbench is the perfect beginner project because there is a ton of room for error and it only requires 2 tools. Again, there are plans to build that workbench linked down in the description below, and you can easily build that project in just a few hours this weekend. Next up is something that I see so few people make, and I truly don't know why. When I started woodworking, I used a $200 job site table saw for years, and it's what launched me into doing all of this today. That saw was a workhorse for me because I set it up to almost work like a full-size cabinet saw. So let's jump into that project next.
Hi, I'm Eric Spencley. Today I'm going to show you guys how we built this mobile table saw stand on Spencley Design Co. So we've had this portable rigid contractor table saw for a little while, and overall it's a great saw. It works well, but the thing we hate is this base here. It's super unstable, and since I'm somebody who's taller than a lot of people, it's really low for me. Not to mention underneath, there's just a ton of wasted space that could be better utilized, especially in a small shop like this. So to remedy all these issues, what we're gonna do is we're gonna build a mobile base. This will be much easier to move around, and it'll also have some drawers underneath, so we can put things like push sticks, blades, and other table saw accessories. Let's get building.
We had our home center break down our plywood into the rough size we needed for this project since we don't have a pickup truck at the moment. The very first thing we needed to do was cut down the panels to make the case of the stand. And as always, there's a full cut list available on our linked website in the description below. Since our table saw only has a rip capacity of 26 inches, and the other side pieces as well as a few other components of the stand needed to be 28 inches wide, we set these pieces on top of some polystyrene foam insulation on the ground to break down with our circular saw. With the pieces clamped together, they still weren't laying quite flat, so we added a few more pieces of foam underneath the panels and then measured out the final width that we needed the panels to be. We don't have a dedicated track saw yet, so we measured the distance between the blade and the edge of the circular saw base and set a straight edge 4.5 inches off of where we needed to cut. With the blade depth set just below the plywood, we could easily cut this piece down to final width. Now, one tip we found helpful to get chip-free cuts is use a higher tooth count blade on your circular saw and go slower than you think you should. We then set our fence on the table saw to the depth of the cabinet at 23.5 inches and cut both sides, top and bottom panels down to final dimension. We always have a tendency to drill holes in the wrong place, so we marked out where the pocket holes needed to go and then grabbed our pocket hole jig. We set both the drill collar and the jig itself to accommodate 3/4 inch stock and then drilled all the holes into the top and bottom of both side panels. We have to admit there's something oddly satisfying about measuring out all the spacing between the holes and having perfect symmetry. Oh yeah. We were then ready to assemble the case. We didn't use any glue in case we needed to break this down in the future, and honestly, the pocket screws will be plenty strong enough. Once the side was clamped to the bottom, we checked it for square and drove in all the pocket hole screws to hold the pieces together. Make sure you have the right screws for this project. We are using the 1 1/4 inch coarse thread that are made specifically for softwoods and plywood. With both sides now attached, we could flip the case over, put the top panel down, and get that perfect alignment, and then drive the rest of the screws in to hold the pieces together. In order to get the back panel to be the exact same size of the case, we set the case up against the blade of the table saw and moved the fence over until it was snugly fit. In a perfect world, this measurement would have been 22 3/4 inches, but plywood is not exactly 3/4 inch thick, so the relative measurement here is crucial to make sure the pieces fit well together. we threw a countersink bit into our cordless drill to create an inset for the head of the screw to hide in. And after attaching 2 adjacent corners, we gave the case some encouragement to bring to square, and then countersink and drove screws to hold the back panel in place. With the case flipped over, we marked out the screw locations for the locking casters, pre-drilled to prevent wood splitting, then used a washer and a lock washer to securely hold the caster to the bottom of the case. These bad boys aren't going anywhere. And at this point, you could be done with the project, but we wanted to add some pull-out drawers. We're going to be making an entire video dedicated to making drawers, so make sure to check that video linked up above. We grabbed the outer segment of our full extension drawer slide and placed a 3/4 inch plywood cutoff to act as a spacer piece to rest the drawer slide on. And after insetting it about 1/16 of an inch from the front of the case, we used the included screws to attach the slide to the case itself. To line the drawers up nicely, we set down a few 1/4 inch plywood scraps to act as spacer pieces, holding the drawer slightly above the bottom of the case, and then inserted the inside of the drawer slide, leaving a small segment sticking out to insert the supplied screw. We then worked our way back, sliding the drawer out just enough until the next screw hole was revealed to fully secure the drawer to the slide. And to attach the next slide, we put down 1 1/4 inch scrap and 2 3/4 inch scraps and attached the slide as before. While we work our way through the rest of the drawers, we want to remind you to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss one of our future videos. We have all kinds of projects coming up, from shop builds, DIY furniture and decor, and even some restoration projects. You definitely won't want to miss what we have coming up. Now that we've got the drawers attached, we need to cut out some false fronts. We first measure the final height of the case and then set our table saw to that exact measurement. And remember one of those scrap pieces that we had left over from the back panel before? Well, this piece is already cut the perfect width, so we just need to dial in the height. This is why you want to go to our website and download those free project plans we were telling you about. With the front piece cut down, we could lay it on the front of the cabinet and mark out where we wanted to cut the drawer fronts. Now, in order to keep the grain flowing down the front of the case, we first numbered out the drawer fronts so we didn't mix them up, and then made a mark on the side where we wanted to make these cuts. Now, the typical table saw blade is 1/8 of an inch, so that will leave the perfect gap between all of the drawers. We didn't really care what the measurement was when cutting the drawer fronts, we just lined the mark that we made up with the blade and made the cut. With the drawer fronts cut down, we could attach them to the drawers by aligning them evenly with the side of the case, clamping them on securely, pre-drilling some holes, and then driving some screws in to hold it securely to the drawer box. We then cut down a 1/8 inch spacer piece from some scrap wood to perfectly space the drawer fronts and continued installing the remaining 2 pieces. With the cabinet complete, we needed to make some drawer pulls, so we found a scrap piece of walnut and sketched out a rough design. If you want, you can always buy drawer pulls instead of making them and completely skip this step. We first cut the block into 3 even pieces, then lowered the blade so it was only cutting about halfway up the block. We made a series of cuts to hog out the middle and then cleaned up the slot with a chisel. Back over at the table saw, we used our cross-cut sled and stop block to cut the drawer poles all down to the exact same size. After a quick sanding to remove any saw blade marks, we clamped the poles onto the drawer, pre-drilled, and then drove some screws in to hold the pole securely to the front. And after all the drawer poles were attached, the final thing that we needed to do was attach our table saw. We first aligned it on the case, marked where we needed to drill holes for the attachment bolts, removed the saw, and then drilled all the way through the case top. Just make sure that you don't hit the drawers underneath. Bringing the saw back over, we could grab some bolts and securely fasten the table saw to the stand. And with that, this project is finished. This stand turned out perfectly. Not only is it a much better height for me, but it also has plenty of storage for all the table saw accessories we use, as well as being much more mobile and sturdy.
Thanks so much for checking out this video, guys. We absolutely love the way this thing turned out, but one of the problems, which you might have noticed, is that this thing is no longer the same height as our outfeed table. So
our next project is going to be a brand new workbench that's going to match the height perfectly.
Having a job site saw built onto a stand like that not only makes it way more stable than those wobbly stands that they typically come with, it allows you to utilize all of the dead space underneath for critical storage of items like push blocks, miter gauges, feather boards, blades, and tons of other table saw accessories. And of course, plans are available for that project too. They're down below. But once you build something like that, you need to ensure that you have proper outfeed support when making all of your cuts on your table saw. I've got a solution for that too, so let's jump into the next project.
Hi, I'm Eric Spencley. Today I'm going to show you guys how we built this mobile workbench, all out of one sheet of MDF and just a couple of 2x4s on Spencley Design Co. So if you've been following this recently, you know that we just finished this table saw cart. The only problem is now our workbench is not the same height. So today we're going to show you how we built a new workbench. Now, since it's safe to assume that most people who want to build a workbench don't already have one, I'm going to show you how to do this entire project on the floor with no special tools. Let's get going. At our home center, we picked up 9 2x4s and 1 3/4 inch sheet of MDF. And if you follow us on Instagram, you know that we set up a little mobile shop in the parking lot since our specific location refuses to cut down any sheet goods. Once we had all the pieces cut down to rough size, we were able to load them up in our pickup truck. And once we were back in the shop, we measured out the length we needed for our 2x4 and used a speed square to mark a perpendicular line to cut. At the miter saw, we first trimmed one end to ensure it was square and brought the saw blade right up to the line that we had marked and cut it to length. Now, to ensure all the similar pieces were cut to the same length, we took the offcut, lined it up to the end of the board, and marked a line to duplicate the length. This technique allows us to have pieces that are the exact same length with fairly accurate precision. As we continue cutting the rest of the pieces for the workbench, we want to remind you that we have a free cut list available linked in the description below at our website, SpencleyDesignCo.com. There you can check out all of our previous projects and get in touch with us if there's a project that you want us to build for you. With all of our pieces cut down to length, we turned our attention to our table saw. While this step is entirely optional, we like a crisp look of a squared off 2x4, so we first removed the rounded edge of each 2x4 and then moved our table saw fence over to a specified width in our plans at 3 inches and removed the other edge to produce extremely square stock. While we grab our respirator and prep the rest of the lumber, we want to know what you think about the 2x4s. Do you think the rounded or square edges look better? Let us know down in the comment section below. After all the lumber was squared off, we set a piece of our MDF down on the shop floor to act as a flat surface for us to work on. We grabbed 2 horizontal side pieces and 2 vertical side pieces. And with the help of a scrap 2x4 block, we aligned the boards properly and then clamped the pieces together. After ensuring that everything was square, we pre-drilled and countersunk a hole before driving a screw to hold the 2 pieces together. We continued working on attaching the rest of the pieces, making sure that everything was square before screwing it together until we had 2 side assemblies completed. We could then grab 2 longer side rails and place them underneath the 2 assemblies we had just finished to help balance them as we attached the long rails above. These were attached the same way, ensuring that we pre-drilled before fixing the pieces together with any screws. And we didn't use any glue on this project since the screws provide a ton of holding power, but if you really wanted to make sure this thing is rock solid, feel free to throw some glue in these joints. And then the moment when you get to stand back from your project and admire how all the pieces fit perfectly together. With the bench flipped upside down, we marked out the location to drill the holes for the casters and attached them with a washer and screw. Truthfully, we tried some of the cheap casters on Amazon before and they've been absolutely awful. Just spend the $20 to $25 for a set of 4 good ones and you won't regret it. Also, don't get yourself trapped inside the bench and have to be a choo-choo train to turn your camera off. With the skeleton of the bench finished, we threw a piece of MDF down on top of some polystyrene foam insulation and used our circular saw paired with a straight edge to cut our tabletop down to final size. Once cut, we lined up one edge and attached a single screw to hold it in place. We then moved to an adjacent corner, lined the sheet up to that edge, and screwed it in place. You will likely need a clamp to hold everything together and prevent things from shifting. The third screw tends to be the hardest because you have to force your bench into square. You can see that ours was slightly off, but with a little pressure with the clamp we were easily able to get everything lined up and screwed together. With the top attached, we needed to flip the table over and attach some support braces to the bottom of the tabletop. And with the support braces attached to the frame of the workbench, we flipped it back over and spent way too much time perfectly measuring out where to put the rest of the screws to hold the tabletop on. It was worth it though. Now since we wanted the bottom shelf of our workbench to hold our shop vac and dust cyclone, we temporarily set them inside the bottom frame to figure out how far over our first support brace needed to be. We then screwed the rest of the braces for the bottom onto the frame before cutting a piece of MDF for the bottom shelf. Sometimes we just spend way too much time laying out the perfect screw locations though. Next, we measured how large to cut the second bottom piece and then ripped it down over on the table saw. Now our casters would interfere with this bottom sheet, so we marked out the area to remove and then used our circular saw to cut the lines we marked. Now the circular saw won't get all the way up to the point, so we finished it off with our jigsaw from the late 90s. And after attaching the bottom panel, we could throw our shop vac and cyclone on the bench and this bad boy was finished.
We're so excited to have this project done and it turned out great. The best thing about finishing this project is we finally have an outfeed table that's the same height as the mobile table saw cart that we just built. You can check out that video right up here.
We also added a switch to the end of the workbench so that we can easily turn on our dust collection whenever we're using the table saw.
You definitely can build something way fancier than this, but honestly, this is all we need. With the top being MDF, it'll be super easy to replace. We put a little wax on the top. It'll help any glue and other water just completely bead off of it, give it a little extra protection. But if the top does get destroyed, all we gotta do is put a new sheet on. At least in Ohio, a full 4x8 sheet of MDF costs about $25, so it's pretty inexpensive to replace. Now in the future, we do plan to add some drawers to the bottom here, but not there yet. That workbench is a little larger and more sturdy than the one I showed you earlier, and it's something that I used for a few years. It was rock solid and gave me tons of outfeed support and a large work surface to work off. And yes, there are plans for that workbench available in the description as well. Like I mentioned in the video though, the underside was a blank canvas that desperately needed some attention. So let's address that in the next project. Hi, welcome to Spencley Design Co. My name's Eric, and today I'm going to show you how we built all these drawers at the bottom of our mobile workbench. Let's check it out.
Ever since we moved into this shop, we've started to accumulate clutter on these shelves that we built. It becomes really frustrating because we often misplace things that we need and it really slows us down when we're trying to complete projects for our weekly videos. There are just a lot of small parts that add up over time and we really don't have a great place to store them and keep them organized. We tried just nailing some things to the wall, and while it works pretty well, we wanted a better solution. One of our largest unoccupied spaces in our shop is located right under our mobile workbench, so that seemed like a perfect place to incorporate some storage.
We built this workbench a couple months back, and it's been absolutely awesome. The one thing though that we want to improve is we want to utilize all this space underneath for something a little bit better. So we're going to add some drawers to the bottom.
We went to our home center to grab a few sheets of 3/4 inch plywood, and since our store won't cut down sheet goods, we just headed outside, threw it in our truck. Well, not so fast. Our Honda Civic isn't a huge fan of sheet goods, so we set down the plywood on top of some polystyrene foam insulation. This foam will act as a cutting mat and prevent the saw blade from hitting the ground. We then paired our circular saw up with the Craig Rip Cut jig to break down the sheets into their rough dimensions. What I mean here is that I cut everything about 1 inch oversized at this point, so I can use the table saw to finalize the dimensions so everything is exact. That's not to say you couldn't use your circular saw for the whole thing, it would just be a lot more work. Oh, and by the way, We have full plans and cut lists available for free for both our mobile workbench that you saw earlier and these drawers over on our website at SpencleyDesignCo.com, which is also linked down in the description below. With the plywood broken down into manageable sheets the Civic can hold, I loaded everything up in the car and strapped it securely down. Now, we only live about a quarter mile away from the home center, so we're happy with this, but if you're getting on the highway, you might want to rethink this idea. And once I got everything home, I unloaded the plywood in the shop and called it a night. The next day, I was about to start breaking the plywood down further until I realized one small thing. These large sheets were not going to work in our shop. So I popped open the garage door only to realize that it's now snowing outside. Lovely. So I wheeled the workbench and table saw cart further up in the shop and then got to work, while getting blasted with snow. This is when I brought a lot of the pieces down to their final size, as I can really dial in the precision on the table saw faster than I can with this circular saw. If you're cutting large sheets like this alone, make sure to use a feather board to help keep that piece against the fence. And now I don't think watching me cut a million pieces of plywood is actually helpful to anyone, since there's a free cut list provided with this project, so let me show you an animation of what we're actually going to be doing here. So, we have this workbench built. And once again, we have a full video and detailed plans for this project that's linked below. On the left side, there's a ton of empty space that we want to utilize for storage. And this is what the bay of drawers is going to look like. There are 2 large drawers at the bottom and 8 smaller drawers on the top of each side for a total of 20 drawers. They're all going to be on full extension drawer slides so we can easily reach everything deep inside the drawer. This bay of drawers will slide in under the workbench, so if we ever build a new bench or something, we can easily slide this whole segment out and keep it. Think future-proofing, if you will. Oh yeah, and they're recessed on purpose. I don't want to bang my knees against any drawer pulls and still want to be able to clamp things to the workbench top. So to get started on everything, we will cut down 3 equal side partitions and then add some top stretchers. This is a perfect place to utilize some scraps. And then add the same stretchers to the bottom to make this whole thing stable. From there, we'll build some drawers that will slide in. Alright, so let's pause for a second and see how that plywood's coming. Okay, great. We're still going. Well, back to the animation. Let me highlight the drawers real quick in case you've never made any of those before. Like I said earlier, there will be 2 different sized drawers, 4 larger ones and 16 smaller ones. They'll be constructed with some pocket holes to make a simple square frame, and then a 1/4 inch sheet of plywood will be glued and nailed to the bottom. No fancy joinery methods here, it's just shop furniture. Then, we will throw some false fronts on each drawer. Alright, so now the plywood has to be finished. Oh, what the f***? Are you kidding me? Still going? Okay, yeah. So that's the drawers, so back to the main build. Like I said earlier, we will add those drawers between the vertical partitions until all 20 drawers are installed. Alright, no, seriously, I've got to be finished cutting now. This guy's not getting a raise next year. Then that whole bay can be attached to the workbench and we will be all set. Hopefully that was actually helpful, walking you through exactly what we're going to be building instead of just seeing me randomly cut a bunch of plywood. And I swear, if I'm not done breaking down plywood now, I'm not finishing this project. Oh, it's done? Alright, cool, great. So there we go. We've got a whole workbench full of drawer pieces. I grabbed our Craig R3 pocket hole jig and set everything up for 3/4 inch stock, then started drilling a few hundred pocket holes into all the front and back pieces of each drawer. And let me tell you, I highly suggest upgrading to the K5 or 4 models if you have to do this many pocket holes. It was terrible. I am curious to know though, what Craig jig does everybody have out there? A poll should pop up at the top of your screen and let me know your favorite version. As I was cutting all the pieces, I started to realize that I could easily add even more organization to the drawers by adding some drop-in panels to help divide the contents inside. By raising the blade about halfway through the drawer sides and making a few cuts indexed by 2 stop blocks on the crosscut sled, I could cut grooves where wood panels could be added to any drawers of my choice. I'll show you more later, but just know this is where I cut those in. Now we can get to putting the drawer boxes together. I grabbed one side and one front, applied a little bit of glue, spread it around evenly, and then clamped the pieces tightly together. And after checking for square, I could drive pocket hole screws in to secure the two pieces together. I repeated the same thing to attach the other side and then attached the back. Miranda came out to lend me a hand since she's the chief glue officer. And while we build all the drawers, if you're enjoying this video and have a quick second of your time to spare, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button down below. That lets YouTube know that they should suggest this video to other viewers, and it really helps us out. Thank you so much. With all the frames of the boxes built, we need to cut down some 1/4-inch plywood for the drawer bottoms. Again, these sheets were cut slightly oversized in the parking lot. I'm just bringing them down to their final size using the table saw and then cross-cutting them to their final size. After a little bit of glue is added to the underside of the drawer box, I set down the 1/4-inch plywood panel and secured it in place with a few brad nails. These nails will just hold the panel in place until the glue dries, but if you want to, you could always come back and reinforce everything with some screws. And to get a perfect fit on this bottom panel, I grabbed our cordless palm router with a chamfer bit and went around the perimeter of the drawer box. This will flush up the edges and kinda hide the plywood. Big thanks to Brad over at Fix This Build That for this idea. As I work my way through the rest of these boxes and make an absolute mess of sawdust, I wanted to ask you to please consider subscribing to our channel. We put out new project videos each and every week, and if you enjoyed this free content, we'd really appreciate your support. At the time of recording, we have 246 subscribers, and we would love to have you join our community and help this tiny channel grow. Thanks so much for your support. With all the drawers finalized, I could rip down the top and bottom stretchers to join the vertical partitions. And look at that, perfect timing. Everyone's favorite truck delivered this massive case of drawer slides. Exactly what we need now. I slid in one of the vertical partitions under the workbench and then set down a drawer slide, one of the drawers, and then another drawer slide, and a final piece of scrap. The reason for doing this is I can now measure the exact length the stretcher pieces need to be for the drawers to operate smoothly. Keen eye will notice that this is about 1/8 of an inch off the plans. That's from small compounded errors and from the plywood not being exactly 3/4 of an inch thick. I then cut all their pieces to their dialed in size on the table saw and then, oh come on, seriously? More pocket holes? And this is when the project really starts to come together into something that looks tangible. I started gluing and screwing all the stretcher pieces to the vertical partitions, making sure that everything was square. I also made sure to stagger the pieces slightly so that none of the screws of the pocket holes hit each other. Once the first layer was on, I dropped on the middle vertical partition and kept working my way through the outer case. Now the exciting part, putting it in the bench. And honestly, for a quick second, I thought it wasn't going to fit, but luckily, even my mediocre woodworking skills prevailed today. To keep the cabinet from sliding around on the workbench, I pre-drilled some countersunk holes and held everything in place while I screwed in some 1-inch screws. And now, time to attach the drawers. Honestly, drawer slides are pretty easy to install if you just take your time. I set down a scrap piece of 3/4-inch plywood on each side of the cabinet. And after grabbing a drawer slide and taking it apart, I could set the thicker segment on top of the block and inset it about 1/16 of an inch from the front of the vertical partition. After attaching it with a few screws and making sure it didn't move around, I could remove the spacer blocks and reinsert the smaller part of the drawer slide. I laid down some scraps of 1/4-inch plywood to prevent the drawer box from bottoming out as it slides, and then pulled the drawer slide out just enough to reveal the first mounting hole on the side. I drove in a screw and then moved to the other side. I continued the process of slowly pulling the drawer out and attaching the slide to the side of the box until it was held in place and everything would slide nicely. Now the next drawer is not much different. I just added 2 scrap pieces this time to elevate the slide and attach it just like I did before. I could then place a 1-inch scrap piece on top of the bottom drawer and then set the next drawer in and work my way up installing all of the drawers on this side of the cabinet. And before moving to the opposite side though, I realized that if I used the same spacer pieces as the other side, the screws holding the drawer slides would hit each other, so I needed to raise the drawer slides on this side a little bit higher with the help of some additional scrap pieces. And once this was all figured out, I could install the rest of them. To attach the drawer fronts, I set down some 1/8 inch scrap and set the drawer front on it, but you could also use some playing cards here. I then secured the drawer front with a few clamps and could slide the whole assembly out. From the inside, I could pre-drill some countersunk holes and then drive in screws to securely hold the drawer front in place. Just make sure to stay off to the side and don't go directly in the center where your drawer poles are going to go. And with the drawer front secured, I removed the clamps and slid it in. The remaining drawers are really no different. Just set that spacer piece on top of the drawer underneath and follow the same steps as before. While I finish up installing these drawer fronts, we want to hear from you. What kind of projects do you want to see us build? Leave us a comment below, and if we pick your idea, we'll feature your comment in a future video. We're super excited to hear what you come up with, and thanks for hanging out with us.
So at this point, we're pretty much done. All the drawers are installed, and the only thing else that we need to do is put some drawer pulls on it. Now, this video is already getting kind of long, so instead of going into all the details, I'm just going to post another video right up here in the future for you to check it out.
I basically just followed the steps that Johnny from Crafted Workshop highlighted in his video a few years back. You just cut some bevels on 4 sides of some scrap pieces, and you'll come up with these poles, simple and cheap. To attach the poles to the drawers, I whipped up this quick jig. It basically just rests on the corner of each drawer and has holes already drilled, so I know exactly where to drill in every drawer. And after removing the jig, you'll have 2 holes and they'll be in the exact same spot on each and every drawer. I also made a few holes in the jig so I could pre-drill holes into the drawer pulls as well. The poles get clamped onto this jig and then the holes are drilled into the pole. Back inside the drawer, I countersunk the holes that were previously drilled through the fronts. And with those holes drilled, I partially threaded some screws in by hand and then drove them in so they're just barely sticking out from the drawer front. I can then insert the point of the screw into the hole on the drawer pole until everything is securely fastened together and the drawer functions perfectly. And the last thing that we wanted to do here was add some colored stripes to each drawer. We picked up this super cheap set of acrylic paint for about $4 that's going to give us a ton of different colors and just the right amount of paint. I taped off a stripe on each drawer front and laid down some white paint to help make the colors pop a little bit more. Now you might have noticed earlier that those top drawers didn't actually match the rest of the drawers. They were cut with some scrap laying around the shop, so we decided to paint those black first. But you know, for anyone who doesn't watch this, they'll think this was some kind of unique design idea. And that's cool too. All these colors will easily allow us to identify drawers. If someone wants to know where a flush trim router bit is, instead of saying, oh, it's the 3rd drawer down on the left side furthest from the shop vac, you just say, seafoam green. With all the colored stripes painted, I threw down some thick water-based poly on the fronts and put the drawers back where they belong. The very last thing I wanted to show you was those drawer dividers that I mentioned earlier. I cut down some hardboard into strips and then I could insert them into the drawers. I'm not sure if we're actually going to use these that much, but at least it's nice to know this is an option, I guess. This stuff is pretty cheap, so it's not really a loss if we end up not using these in a single drawer. Okay, now we're done. Overall, this project really isn't that hard. It's just plywood cut into different sized squares, or rectangles, or I don't know what shape it is. I'll go with shapes. It's been way too long since I took geometry and had to recall that Venn diagram about which shape is which or whatever. But in all seriousness, while this project is the most involved one we've done to date, it really wasn't difficult in the classic meaning of the word. Yeah, it was tedious and boring, to be honest with you. Repeating every step 20 times got old super fast, so if you plan on doing this, invest in some good audiobooks or some good music or something. But don't let me discourage you. It was still a blast being out in the shop and making the most of our social distancing time during the coronavirus threat.
Thanks so much for stopping by and checking out this video here. We absolutely love the way these drawers turned out. So our favorite part about the build is all the colors in the drawers. It's gonna be so easy to find things and describe where everything is. So if you wanna find, maybe an extra saw blade, check out the orange drawer. The other thing that we're super excited about are all the dividers inside. This will easily allow us to organize all of our tools and keep everything in a neat, organized spot. Those drawers turned out to be an incredible use of space underneath the workbench and are a super cost-effective solution compared to buying an expensive tool chest like this. Plus, you can completely customize the size and shape of every single drawer to perfectly suit your individual needs. Again, there are plans linked down in the description for every single project in this video, so make sure to check those out if you want to build any of these projects. Next up is one that will save you a boatload of money when you're making any shop project. For some reason, cabinet hardware like drawer pulls are extremely expensive, and they add up really fast if you're making tons of drawers. You really don't need anything super luxury when you're building shop projects, so why not just make them yourself? In the next project, I will walk you through how to make your very own custom drawer pulls out of scrap wood. So let's get right into it. Hey, welcome to Spencley Design Co. I'm Eric, and today I'm going to show you how we built these drawer pulls for our mobile workbench. Let's check it out. Now before we get started making the drawer pulls for these drawers here, make sure to check out the video up here. That's part one. That's how we built all these drawers into our mobile workbench.
To get started on this project, we moved over our table saw and tilted the blade to about 25 degrees. Now unfortunately, this project is one that 100% requires a table saw, so you won't be able to finish this with just a circular saw. Sorry guys. I adjusted the fence so the blade will barely cut off one end of the board and then ran the piece through the table saw. Now we aren't giving any specific dimensions here because the plywood we're using is just offcuts from our previous project, but follow the same general steps and you'll have the exact same outcome. One thing to be aware of when making bevel cuts like this is that the offcut has a tendency to shoot backwards. Practice good table saw safety and make sure to stay clear of the wood as you cut. And I think it's important to be fully transparent with the projects we do, so I want to give credit to Brad over at Fix This Build That and Johnny at Crafted Workshop for inspiring us with this method of making drawer pulls. And with the bevel cut on one side of each piece, I slid the fence over to about 1.5 inches, which will make the final height for all of the drawer pulls. Just make sure that the beveled edge that you just cut is against the fence of the table saw, and run the piece through again so that you have a bevel cut on both sides. And while we cut down those pieces, we want to remind you to check us out over on Instagram at Spencley Design Co. You can help us reach 1,000 followers and check out all of our projects before they make it to YouTube. I think you're going to love what we have over there. Instagram is also our social media of choice. So if you ever just want to drop a comment, ask a quick question, come over there. We're happy to interact with you. And after ripping a bevel on both sides of all the pieces, we are ready to cut the ends. I grabbed our stock miter gauge that came with our table saw, however I added an extra board screw to it for some extra support, and then placed one piece securely against it. I then ran the piece through the saw, making sure to push the offcut fully past the blade. And if you stop, there's a high likelihood that the piece will kick back or get jammed between the throat plate and the blade, like this. While I cut the ends off the rest of the pieces, I also want to remind you to hit that like button below if you'd like to help support our channel. And if you're really interested in seeing more from us, click that subscribe and bell icon below so you never miss a future video. Thanks! To cut the poles down to their final size, I clamped a scrap block to a fence with a miter gauge and then ran the pieces through the saw again. Just make sure to use a scrap piece of wood to hold the pole while cutting so you don't have your fingers super close to the blade. While I cut these down, I want to know, what do you want us to build? Leave a comment below, and if we pick your idea for a future project, we'll feature your comment in our video. Thanks for all the great ideas in advance. We cut down a total of 20 drawer poles, and I couldn't help but to stack them in a really cool pattern. Figured someone out there with OCD would love it. Whoops. I then started the tedious task of sanding all of the edges down with a random orbit sander. However, lucky for you, you get to watch a 5-minute edited version of this project that only includes about 10 seconds of sanding. So I'll spare you from having to watch anymore.
So that's it. That's how you make these drawer pulls. With as many drawers as we have on this project, we wanted something that was not only cheap, but used up a lot of scraps around the shop. Now, a regular drawer pull is right about $2 to $4, and we have 20 drawers that we need a pull for, so that's talking about $40 to $80. And for a shop project like this, it's not worth it in our mind. Being able to create custom drawer pulls saves you tons of money and allows you to get exactly what you want while using up scraps that you probably would have just thrown out in the first place. Those are 9 of my favorite shop projects I've made, but I've got even more coming in the future, so I'll see you on the next one.